Hello everybody and welcome to another episode. And today we're going to be talking about contextualization. And I don't want to start by talking about it as a rubric point. I want to look at how historians actually use it. And I think that approach is important because sometimes in class there's this tendency to start to think about contextualization as simply an introduction to an essay. So let's take a look at what historians actually do with this, how important it is in making sense out of evidence and using it in arguments. And when you begin to do that and just write solid arguments, you can forget about rubrics and counting points because you'll already have all those points in the bag. Every historical narrative is incomplete. It's like our window to history has blinds and keeps us from seeing a perfect picture of the past. Historians are like detectives, using these fragmented bits of evidence to solve a mystery, always widening their view to include other supporting facts that might challenge or support their stories. This need for context can really be seen all around us today. In 2018, a journalist in London took this picture of Prince William when he was getting into his limousine. As you can imagine, the tabloids in London went nuts, but anyone concerned with contextualization would want more details to understand this reaction. They might stop and ask, is our initial interpretation really accurate? What question was he asked? What else was going on that might have provoked the future King of England to respond this way? Of course, there's more to it than that. In reality, Prince William was leaving the hospital after his wife had just given birth to their third child, and he was telling the reporter that 3 kids is 3 times the work. And a picture taken at the same time from a different point of view corroborates this. So you see how little more information or context makes our understanding more accurate. It's the same when working with historical evidence. Zooming out a little bit, or bringing in some relevant information, or understanding the intention of people is essential in properly using evidence and in making our arguments more relevant. Now, all of this makes its way into the DBQ in 2 ways. When we consider the historical context of a document, it's called sourcing, and when we consider the historical context of an entire topic or argument, it's called contextualization. Now let's look at an example from the DBQ we've been working on. Now we need to be reminded of the prompt because the kind of historical context we're working on here, which is a type of sourcing on the DBQ, has to be relevant to the prompt and the argument. So, evaluate the extent to which Qing empire building transformed elites in China between 1600 and 1900. Now let's look again at document 5. Now, it's very clear how we could use evidence from this document to argue that elites changed in China. It's clear that the Han are being held back from government posts, while the Manchus are being favored. Now, how can we widen our view, bring in relevant historical knowledge, and understand this process even better? Look where it mentions Han and Manchus with certain grades and graduations. So here you could widen the discussion to talk about the Confucian civil service exam and how this was used for centuries in China to place elites in the bureaucracy. So it seems the Qing have lower expectations for their own Manchu and their scores than for the Chinese. They're applying an unfair grading system to ensure that Manchus get promoted over Han Chinese. So you see how we just use outside information to strengthen our use of evidence and have a greater understanding of how elites in China were changing. So let's look at another example. You might remember this from class. The prompt is evaluate the extent to which European imperialism changed between 1492 and 1900. Now, document 6 makes pretty harsh statements about the mental and social capacities of uncivilized people. The author says they can't focus for very long, they have never grown out of a childlike state. And at the end he writes, they could not be other than they are in the absence of the condition brought about by social evolution. Now, there's plenty of relevant historical content you can bring to contextualize this and make it more relevant to an argument about changes in imperialism. You could write, Mr. Spencer was writing at a time when Darwin's ideas were applied to races and societies. The impact of social Darwinism is clearly seen in the low opinion he has of uncivilized people, which would make the imperialism of non-whites more intense. Do you see how at the end we brought it back to the question. We brought it back to the argument, which is about changes in imperialism. That clinches it, and that makes this outside information, social Darwinism, relevant to the argument. So that's necessary. Now, you might want to write about the author's intention, another way of sourcing. You could say, Spencer probably describes uncivilized people as children because Britain was expanding its colonial holdings in Africa and Asia, places they thought less civilized. This was written during the scramble for Africa, and he probably intended to support the new imperialism by justifying Britain's civilizing mission. Once again, there's outside information, the scramble for Africa, and how this changes imperialism. So the important thing to remember in both of these cases is that sourcing must be used in the service of the argument. Please avoid simply discrediting the document. And some people did this in the last DBQ. People said something like, well, the author of this document was kicked out of his job, so he's probably exaggerating how bad things were. Or, well, the author is a Manchu, so he's biased against the Chinese. Well, so what? How does that help the argument? It doesn't at all. So don't even use the word biased. I mean, that's why by the last few days of the AP reading, when we're grading your essays, teachers are going to be like,
shut your festering gob, you tit! Your type makes me puke! You vacuous, toffee-nosed, malodorous pervert! Look, I came in here for an argument!
Okay, so graders really aren't like that at all, but your sourcing better show up with an argument. Okay, so we've seen that putting evidence in historical context makes it more persuasive and accurate, and if used to support the argument, it's called sourcing the document. Now, if you do the same thing for the entire topic of your essay, it's called contextualization. And to demonstrate how this works, let's look at an example that's relevant to all of us right now. So I have a question for you. How has the move to online classes impacted the effectiveness of this class? Seriously, I'm really interested in that question. And if it were framed as a DBQ, it would read like this. Evaluate the extent to which the move to online classes impacts the effectiveness of advanced placement instruction. Now, I think we can all agree that this question would be much different to you if I'd asked it in January. But now it's relevant because there is a specific context for it. And my guess is that your responses would claim that there are some benefits and efficiency, such as no announcements, no interruptions, or former students randomly showing up with food in my class, but also that efficiency is hindered by not having the benefit of other students' questions or opinions, or not being able to ask questions in real time to the teacher. Now, in formal writing, we wouldn't simply throw our opinions out there. We would situate this topic in place and time to get those opinions across. It might look like this. In late 2019, the coronavirus made its first appearance in China. By early 2020, it reached the United States and spread quickly into most every state. To maintain public health, the governor shut down schools in March, and every class was changed to an online class, a move that brought efficiency in some areas, but also hindered student learning in others. And then would come your thesis about the benefits and efficiency, or the loss of efficiency. But notice how the question was nestled in an actual historical context. What it didn't do was something like this. Throughout history, new technologies affected the way we do things. Sometimes those changes brought benefits. Sometimes they had the opposite effect. Online learning was the same. Or teachers have always used different tools in the classroom. They adapt to different situations and they try new things. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Look, you don't ever want to do that because there's no real content there. It doesn't work. But don't just take my advice. Let's ask another exam reader how he responds to that type of writing.
At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought.
So don't be that student. Notice how contextualization needs some level of specificity, some actual history. So this brings up an important fact. To do contextualization, you have to know some actual history. Maybe not specific details, but at least broad movements, changes, or events that can be called out by name. And this will be hardest for those who skimped on the reading and note-taking this year. Now, let's move away from coronavirus and consider an example for the DBQ we've been working on in class. And again, the prompt. Evaluate the extent to which Qing empire building transformed elites in China between 1600 and 1900. Now, that prompt is the bullseye. We want to step out of it and provide a larger historical setting. Remember, this has to involve actual history. So here's the forbidden city in Beijing, the Qing capital. We can zoom out and consider events far outside that came to play into our topic, such as the nomads of the Central Asian steppes. These are the people who plagued China for centuries, and you might remember the Xiongnu, but all of you should know the Mongols, who invaded and temporarily ruled China, and then the Manchus came in, overthrew the Ming, and established the Qing dynasty. You had a minority ethnic group ruling over a majority of conquered people, and the Manchu were ruling over Han Chinese, and establishing ruling elites was a problem for them. Your contextualization for this DBQ might read like this. For centuries, China suffered from invading nomads on their frontier. The Mongols invaded in the 13th century and established their own dynasty over the Chinese, and a few centuries later, China was again conquered as the Manchus moved in and established the Qing dynasty and set up rule over the ethnic Chinese people. The rule would lead to clashes between the Han Chinese and the ruling Manchus and transformed who would become political elites. Note how this makes a broad general statement, contains some actual history, and then walks toward the specific topic of the essay. All is set now for the thesis. But before we end, let's take a few samples from the Contextualization Hall of Fame and look how students on previous essays successfully situated their topic in a historical context. So a few years ago, we had this question on the test. Evaluate how the Columbian Exchange affected peoples in the Americas between 1450 and 1750. So this is about the Columbian Exchange. How do we want to step back in place and time and give context for the Columbian Exchange? Here's an excellent example. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks invaded Constantinople and cut Europeans off from their primary trade route to China. To avoid trading with Muslims and paying religious taxes to them, Europeans began to send out explorers to find other routes to get to China. In these attempts, they made it to the Americas, and exchanges of crops, diseases, and culture began. And then would come the two statements or the historical claims that would make up the thesis. Okay, so here's another. Evaluate the extent to which the Portuguese transformed maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century. So here's an example of a good contextualization for that essay topic. Because of trade, navigational technologies such as the compass and the lateen sail made their way into Europe. With these technologies, explorers such as Diaz rounded the bottom of Africa and introduced Europeans to the Indian Ocean trade network. The Portuguese, in particular, took an interest in Asian spices, resulting in many investments in the spice trade. And then it would go on to talk about the effect that the Portuguese had in maritime trade in the Indian Ocean. So look what this did. It stated a broad historical development, it gave some specifics, and then it brought in Portugal, thus steering the sentences towards the particulars of the prompt. And then comes the thesis, which will simply state at least two historical claims about how the Portuguese transformed maritime trade in the Indian Ocean. Now this is very important. It makes perfect sense to put this contextualization at the beginning of your essay. But realize, even though it comes at the beginning, you can't really begin to write this paragraph until after you have your claims in your topic sentences. So pre-writing, annotating the documents and forming your claims really needs to be done first. So look to Volume 8 of Cooking with Hindi to be reminded again how to do that. So there you have it, the skill of contextualization, both to enhance your use of evidence in sourcing the documents and in situating the topic of your essay.